Welcome to the podcast. I'm Marc and this is DSR's Above Average Intelligence Show. Today, I'm very happy to welcome as my guest, Mr. Shane Harris, a repeat guest, of course. Shane has been on before, always a tremendous insight into the intelligence community, into national security policy. Let me just a little quick bio on Shane. Most of you will know him, but for those who don't, he's written about intelligence, security, and foreign policy for more than 2 decades. He's now actually at The Atlantic after having left the Washington Post. We could talk about that in a second. Congratulations on the new gig. Shane covered U.S. intelligence agencies and national security and was part of the team that won the 2021 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for stories about the January 6th attack on the Capitol and efforts to overturn the presidential election. And in 2019, he was part of the team that was a finalist for the Public Service Award for coverage of the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Shane, I'll read a little bit more of your bio. We'll talk about it. But I was just as I was looking at this morning. One of the funny things is like these are incredible stories that you reported on. I don't know if anyone gives a shit based on the last election, but that's not to say you're not an outstanding journalist. I just don't think anyone.
This is how I'm processing things over the past 5 or 6 weeks. Well, that was fun.
Shane has previously been a staff writer for the Wall Street Journal, the Daily Beast, and the National Journal. Author of 2 books, and he frequently appears on national, international television and radio. A resident of Washington D.C. Truth be told, a friend of mine who I've gotten to know since I kind of decided to speak in public after my career in the intelligence community. But Shane is, as I always tell folks, one of the great intelligence writers of our time. So welcome. And again, not to diminish all your incredible achievements, but this is my catastrophizing about the current state of America.
I feel you. Thanks, Marc. It's good to be back on with you.
Let me start off. We're going to have a little bit of fun. We're going to talk about some serious stuff, but as I was mentioning to you in our little, I don't know if it's called a green room when you do podcasts, but I've come up with 4 commandments that's going to try to get me through the day. And so I wrote them down as I was kind of thinking about my life and how to kind of analyze what's happening. One is I will not catastrophize today, so we're not going to do that. Number 2, I will not open that second bottle of wine. I think
that's the key.
Alcohol abuse has probably gone crazy in Washington these days. I will not doom scroll, and I'm not going to rage text. And so these are the things I'm going to try to deal with. But really, where to begin? As this is not just the election. We're not going to talk about that. But in terms of kind of the cabinet picks and where we go, things seem to have gone a little crazy. Kind of your overall thoughts on that before we kind of dive into some nitty gritty.
Yeah, I mean, I think that long before the election, months before the election, when certainly reporter friends of mine or, kind of people like you who I talk to who are experts in the community, you could imagine kind of like if you're drawing up like your imaginary list in a group text or something of like, okay, like what would the craziest cabinet be? What would be the most outlandish picks that if he won, kind of who would be on your bingo card? And I got to say the bingo card is pretty much filled out. This is, people had anticipated names like Kash Patel, who has been put forward now for FBI director, names like John Ratcliffe, who now will be CIA director. I don't know that anybody really anticipated like Tulsi Gabbard as the DNI or why anyone would have imagined Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense. But, sort of the kind of the caliber of people in terms of, frankly, not very much experience at all, very surface level. That was something I think that, certainly observers were anticipating would happen here. People who were very much outwardly on board with the sort of Trump MAGA agenda. You can check that box. So it's no real surprise there. And some of the kinds of names, Kash Patel kind of at the top of that list, who people assumed would be at the vanguard of this campaign of retribution that Donald Trump had promised. This is none of this should be surprising to anyone. These are precisely the kind of people who either were anticipated individually or the kinds of people who I think we imagine would be in these picks. And I think if you look across, the sort of the DOD, FBI, CIA, DNI kind of layer, and maybe we can put the White House and the State Department off to the side for a second and come back to them. It looks exactly like the cast of characters that you would expect for him to be leading the campaign to root out the deep state, to pull it up root and branch. These are people who have talked about that, who have sort of made this a central focus of their criticism of the national security community when they were either, on television or serving in the Congress in Gabbard's case. So to me, it looks like Donald Trump is doing precisely what he promised that he would do.
It was as we were talking before the show, I was on MSNBC this morning and on with Jonathan Lemire, the 5 a.m. show, but the 6 a.m. show, I'm still at the studio and I'm listening, and Joe and Mika were reading the letter that Pete Hegseth's mom wrote to him, and it was this is actually sad. It was kind of obviously some family dynamics, but everyone was kind of visibly uncomfortable because it was kind of so brutally honest on what a kind of rotten human being this individual had things he had been exhibiting, and it's coming from a mother to a son. Yeah. I don't see how things like that, and of course, then there's this new piece in the New Yorker, which with allegations of all sorts of alcohol abuse. That's just kind of a little bit of a teaser. That's the appetizer for what's going to come when RFK Jr.'s hearing comes along, because he's totally insane in terms of his past and all the nutty things he's done. And Tulsi Gabbard, who not only has espoused pro Syria, pro Bashar al-Assad sentiments for Syria, pretty bad time to do that, mind you.
Yeah. Sure.
Reiterated talking points from the Kremlin, but also has this really weird background. I'm sorry, I'll get criticized here. Like, she's like a member of a cult. It's bizarre, and so I think that the hearings are going to be, pretty. I hate to say must-see TV because that kind of plays into what Trump wants. But there's some really kind of fringe people involved here, and I would imagine, and maybe this is a good question for you, because I think you probably, I don't want to put words in your mouth, agree on this, but the Republican senators, there's some who are going to be supportive of this, who kind of bend to the knee to Trump, but I think a lot of them are really not thrilled with this idea of having this giant spectacle of what would be kind of just salacious stuff going on every single day. We're talking about 4 different nominations here.
Yeah. No, I think that, you can kind of, I sort of think about the shortcomings of these nominees, and kind of comprising different categories. One is just the insufficient resumes, right? Which is not to say that, by the way, you have to be, in order to run the Defense Department, you must be an expert on military policy. I think, Leon Panetta, of course, ran the CIA, and he had only ever been a consumer.
He did a good job.
And I think he arguably did a good job because he understood management. He understood leading organizations. He did understand the role that intelligence plays in the broader foreign policy making of the United States government. But you take someone like Pete Hegseth, for Secretary of Defense, it's simply implausible. This is not someone who has ever run an organization of any size at all. Right. He might be an intelligent person. He went to a good school, fine. He seems to be articulate, but that does not qualify you to be the CEO of a 3 million plus person organization with a near $1 trillion budget and a global footprint. That's like saying that because I'm a good home cook, I'm qualified to run the McDonald's Corporation. These don't translate. So there's that problem. And then look, you can really question, I think, in the current political environment, whether character matters at all in leadership, but it will nevertheless become a very convenient focus for lawmakers and the public in these hearings. And again, just to pick on Pete Hegseth again for a moment, his character is absolutely front and center at this moment. And that is not where the administration wants to be when he is staring down a confirmation process, from a skeptical Senate. These senators will never come out en masse and say it, but we right. know just from previous experience how many of them have profound misgivings about Donald Trump, not enough to actually oppose him outwardly, but who are not going to be supportive or going to have real misgivings about a Secretary of Defense nominee, whose own mother has written him an email saying how ashamed she is of him because of the way he treats women. That's not great. The Kavanaugh hearings are not that far from people's memory, and this promises to be again kind of spotlighting on issues of character and treatment to women, and maybe now alcohol abuse, according to the New Yorker piece. That doesn't even get to when you put Tulsi Gabbard in the chair and say, so are you just really fond of Vladimir Putin, or do you have a relationship with the Russian government? What is it? Before we decide to give you the keys literally to the U.S. intelligence community, kind of have some questions that we'd like you to answer about your affinity for Russia. Oh, and by the way, the foreign travel that you may have made to these countries, who paid for it? Who did you meet with? I mean, look, these are people who, if they were subjected to an FBI background check for the process of nomination, which it sounds like they might not be, would have trouble passing it, probably.
I mean, Shane, they wouldn't get past the first 5 minutes.
Yeah.
A summer intern at CIA who actually says, I love Vladimir Putin, they will say, it's been nice. I hope you have a nice trip back to your college. Enjoy your summer.
Maybe go apply for the internship at RT.
Not even close. I mean, that's the idea of, you can quibble about experience.
Yeah.
But when it comes to suitability, you can't.
That's it.
And the idea of, I don't know how they do this if some of these nominees go forward and then they have to, not encourage, but require the other 3 million intelligence community and DoD employees to get background checks. Well, why? Right. Why does it matter if this person is doing this? And, so I think it does throw into, and this does end up to be a key national security issue. Let me just kind of so you do have this idea of, and there are the crazy versus the normie picks. I mean, the normie, look, I have no problem with Marco Rubio, and Mike Waltz. Right. You might not agree with them on stuff, but they have those two things. They have experience, and they certainly are suitable for their jobs. Of course,
totally plausible nominees.
Yeah, totally plausible. And the president deserves to have people around him. But these fringe picks, I mean, in some ways, and I can't reason with anybody. First of all, no one's going to listen to me. But if you said you want a successful Trump presidency, this is not the way to do it. Right. If he wants to be this consequential president. And the other point, too, is I think a lot of us in the national security world, that this is something I jotted down here, the reform of the intelligence community and DoD is absolutely necessary. And so nobody's going to quibble with that. This is just not reform. This is destroying institutions. So let's jump into that for a second. Because you've written so much on the IC and national security. I mean, is there anything wrong with saying that, hey, these institutions need to be reformed in some fashion?
No. And I look, I've written about government reform in one shape or fashion for most of my career. I mean, the idea that government is this static institution that should be, immune to change and should not be self-reflective. I mean, that's crazy. And I think, too many times what we see is bureaucracies becoming hidebound and kind of, slaves to process. And, well, this is the way we've always done things. I mean, look, you were in the CIA at 9/11 and saw the painful years-long transformation that the intelligence community had to go through and experience in order to adapt from, an old enemy of the Soviet Union in the Cold War days to a new enemy of terrorism. I think that it arguably did that, quite well, not without stumbles, not without great controversy. But these are organizations that do understand what it means to go through changes and reforms and to be responsive to world events. And oftentimes they are slow to do that. Nothing at all wrong with that kind of reform. And look, and I think even if a president feels that, to take Pete Hegseth and his sort of war on, DEI, which I think is actually just, chauvinism masquerading as some sort of policy preference. But if you really wanted to take on, what you thought were legitimate personnel policies in hiring or whatever, sure, there's even a place for a president to be able to say, I think our policy would be better served if we oriented this way on hiring versus that way. Okay. But you don't turn it into political gamesmanship. Don't turn it into sound bites, and red meat for the base. Actually, honestly address if you think that there's a policy problem. What I find, so interesting about these picks too, is that you mentioned Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, the national security designate, who of course doesn't have to go through Senate confirmation, so he will have that job. These are serious people by comparison, right? And they're people who think about foreign policy, who have written about it, who have talked about it, who have run campaigns, and Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz is both on it. How exactly are they going to square their stated desires to focus on China as a rising strategic threat to the United States with, what Kash Patel is going to be doing in trying to go through and presumably prosecute the people who did Crossfire Hurricane in 2016? I mean, these are going to be massively competing impulses by people sitting at the top of the policymaking apparatus. Maybe Trump wants that. I don't know. He seems to like it when his aides and his advisors fight with one another, which is what they did for 4 years. And maybe that's the kind of, sort of den of vipers that he's trying to replicate now. But that doesn't seem conducive to your point, Marc, about, giving the president the policy making apparatus that he needs and that he earned by election. This is not going to be conducive to good policymaking, which is why I think that that's actually not what Donald Trump's interested in. I think what he's interested in is the fight. And he's interested in the spectacle.
And that notion of retribution, we'll get to that in one sec. As you were saying this, I had some, flashbacks, not always great ones, to National Security Council meetings, for example, in the Obama administration, which was, that was an NSC, which was, everyone knew was incredibly bloated. I think there was 400 people there, and we'd have these interminable meetings. And I was at a level where it was not, certainly not the principals committee, the deputies committee. Then you have like the IPC and the sub IPC. I don't even know what they're stand for, but I just knew that I would be dragged down there to these things. But think about, let's go back. Think about a deputies, or actually a principals committee meeting where you'd have usually chaired, sometimes the president will show up and the national security advisor will chair this. And you have Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, and Kash Patel around a table, talking about what do we do about the Iranian nuclear program, or Chinese aggression against Taiwan. I mean, that is a little fearful, frankly, because these people are so absolutely on the fringe and unqualified. I think someone, when you talk about DOD, it's one of the most powerful positions on the planet. When you talk about the DNI, for example, Tulsi Gabbard would have the knowledge of our most sensitive assets. I mean, the DNI, people, sometimes say, well, it's not as important. It's a coordinating body. But the access there is to everything. And they put together the PDB, the President's Daily Brief. And so that is what you tell the president and the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense and others every day in terms almost what are the intelligence priorities. And so the amount of damage, I mean, it is actually truly alarming and scary. And the first Trump administration, for whatever you think of it, did have serious people there who during a meeting like that of the principals of the deputies committees would have serious discussions on things. So it's
yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure where we're going here, but I want to talk one quick thing about retribution. And so obviously, you have Kash Patel, who, again, the hearing will be a shit show, frankly, because it's not like, what do you think? Because he's already said what he thinks. It's more of what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. But talking about retribution against journalists like yourself, against former U.S. government officials like myself, I guess, seeing where we are now and the Patel nomination is probably in some question, but do you think this will happen? I know that's just an opinion.
Yeah.
Because I have a lot of friends who are Republicans, although I'm having a little trouble with them these days. But I do have friends who are Republicans who really are saying like, oh, he's never going to get confirmed. That'll never happen. You all have nothing to worry about. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we're kind of getting into the realm of, political prediction here, which is always dangerous. But let's just look at the facts, right? Which is to say that, if you took a secret poll of senators, would Kash Patel, gain the necessary majority to become the FBI director? No, he would not. I mean, he would pretty resoundingly fail, as would Tulsi Gabbard, and I suspect as would Pete Hegseth. But that's not the world that we're in. So, Donald Trump, I think in the transition, or was it in the transition, or was it after the election, right before? I can't remember, but the tweet or the bleat that he sent out saying that essentially he was demanding that the Senate, go give, recess appointment authority, or essentially go into recess. That was the tell, right? It was that he was going to start nominating people who, he would really prefer not to put through the formal confirmation process and try to get them in recess appointments. And, I have questions too around, what are the qualifications for being an acting versus an interim?
Right. We had talked about that. Yeah.
Right. We've talked about that. And I'm still somewhat confused on this. But I think, let's just suffice to say that there are ways that Donald Trump can install people in the position he wants without going through the normal process. Will he opt to do that? I would think that he would want to do that. Yes. And avoid, the spectacle and what will be the distraction of putting these people through confirmation process, which, as you and listeners know, are usually pretty perfunctory affairs. Right. You might have, one controversial, pick that goes through. He's got like 4. Right. I mean, there's going to be multiple spectacles going on at the same time.
And we're not even talking about Dr. Oz yet.
We're not even going to get to Dr. Oz yet, or exactly. And I don't know if the FDA commissioner or CMS has. I mean, it's just an amazing array of people who will make for must-see TV, and I don't think that's the kind of must-see TV actually that Donald Trump is looking for.
Do you think, one quick thing on this? Do you think the Democrats are being quiet now because they're just they're going to let the Republicans simply just hang themselves on this?
I suspect so. I mean, why throw your adversary a life raft when they're drowning? Yeah. Right. And I think that look, I mean, you saw Matt Gaetz, kind of pull himself out of the process, early on, which spared them, that nomination hearing. I suspect, the same thing could potentially happen to Pete Hegseth. And what's interesting is when Gaetz pulled out, Trump replaced him with Pam Bondi, who will have no problem getting confirmed. Right. I mean, she was 9 years the Attorney General of Florida. Yeah. I mean, is she a partisan warrior? Sure, but she's also qualified to be the Attorney General, whether you like it or not.
I have friends who actually know her very well and said she, and again, this is pre kind of extreme MAGA, and said she's totally qualified.
Yeah, absolutely. She's a perfectly credible person, and the president deserves to have his cabinet, so long as I think, we all agree that they're qualified, and the Senate has a say on this too. So, do I imagine that, will Kash Patel be the FBI director? I mean, it seems a little questionable to me, but will he find a way to get him installed? Yeah, I could see that. Right. Will Kash Patel have a role somewhere in the administration? Sure. I mean, he has before. It's interesting to me, too, that there are people who we expected to be getting jobs who haven't yet. Like, why does Rick Grinnell not have a job?
Yeah, where's Rick Grinnell?
Why does Robert O'Brien not have a job yet? What's going on there? So that's interesting, to me. And I think with all of this, people have asked, me, and I know others have been asked this too, do you think this is all just like 3-dimensional chess and Trump is using one as the heat shield so he can get the other? No. Okay, this man does not play 3-dimensional chess. He is putting Kash Patel up as the FBI director because he wants Kash Patel to be the FBI director. Yep. Whether he gets that or not is an open question, but that is what he wants. And I think that, you didn't ask the question because we're looking, but I think that we also need to consider that the act of nominating is itself an act, right? Whether he gets it or not, he is saying, this is my priority. Right. This is what I value in an FBI director. And even if Kash Patel does not become that person, Trump has made this statement. And I think you can argue that the damage to national security and law enforcement has already been done merely by nominating someone like Kash Patel, given the things we know about what he believes and what he's done.
Let's switch just a little bit because you just came back from a recent trip to Europe, and it's interesting. I think I called you from London. I was there before your trip. Yeah. And I spoke with journalists and academics and several former senior European intelligence officials, and we're going to be very careful on how we characterize this because you want to keep everyone's confidence. Yeah. But I was actually there for the Tulsi pick. And I'll just say over in more public forums, there's a stiff upper lip. And if you get a couple of drinks in these people, it's a little bit different. Yeah. It's more of a WTF. I got lots of text with that. So I guess the question for you after your trip, and you're probably going to write on it, so you don't want to reveal all that much. But overall, how is Europe looking at us with this, I don't know if you want to call it dysfunction, with a unique administration right now, and perhaps some pending chaos. Because I do think it's it is important to talk to your friends sometimes. Yeah. Who can give you kind of perhaps a view you don't necessarily have from across the pond. So, what are your thoughts about your trip?
Yeah, I mean, and so in talking to U.S. allies in several countries, both before the election but mostly since the election. I think there are kind of broadly two reactions that are kind of common across all countries. One is a kind of shock but not surprised, right? I mean, they expected to see people like Kash Patel, other names they were familiar with, these people who have been these sort of like Trumpian warriors. They expected to see them installed in positions of authority. It's still kind of a stunner to actually see it happening, but they expected this, so they're shocked but not surprised. And the second is, I think, is a realization that they have got to find a way to do business with this administration. They don't have a choice. I mean, whether it's the Brits or the Australians, the Canadians, the Germans, the Ukrainians, whoever. I mean, these people all understand, these leaders, that they are the junior partner in the security relationship. They depend directly on the United States for military support, for intelligence provision, and they've got to find a way to do business. I mean, if you look at it's interesting. If you look take just the UK, for instance. I think, in talking over the years to British officials, they feel like they got a lot done with the first Trump administration. They felt like they could navigate that. They learned its sort of highways and byways, which were peculiar. And to your point about like endless committee meetings and layers of sub processes, the Trump administration didn't have that. I mean, you could just kind of get cabinet officials on the phone. I think that they would say, like, look, we got a lot of things done that were in the British interest. And I think other countries would probably feel to some degree that too. NATO held together, for all of Donald Trump's, extortive posture towards President Zelensky. We were providing lethal aid to Ukraine. So I think that people I talk to are kind of looking back on that moment and saying, hey, there's a way to work with these people. We do have some muscle memory. This is not the conglomeration of people we would pick, but we've got to work with the Americans. The thing that is different now, I think, is that everyone is, expecting there to be this retribution campaign that could be a huge distraction. That raises all kinds of questions, by the way, on how much intelligence do we share with the Americans? I mean, right. The intelligence mostly comes from us to our allies, but there are times, particularly, allied services that have really specialized capabilities or are in places where we might not be as much. Are they going to think twice about what they share with this administration? Are they worried? Answer yes. That the president was indicted for mishandling classified information because he took it home to Florida. There's that apprehension that is there. And then, of course, I think for a lot of European countries, do we leave NATO? Yeah. I mean, is this the time now when Donald Trump says, that's it, we're getting out, or we're stepping back in such a way that effectively gets us out? And you are already seeing, this debate and this conversation in European countries about, can we really depend on the United States? Do we need to invest more in our own military buildup and increasing capacity? Are they always going to be there? And I think that's going to become a dominant question for the next year or two. And that's when we'll probably know how much can, our NATO allies and partners actually depend on us to be there.
One of the things that I found in my discussions, and it really was with a range of different former senior European services, was, look, there are some things that we'll continue to do because we have to. So, some of our, for example, collection capabilities are so intertwined with others, you can't separate them. Right. But when it comes to, in the words of the British, agent running, I love that. I wish the CIA had used that. Mm-hmm. It's such a kind of a great, a great vision there. But in terms of the bond you have as an intelligence service with your agents, your assets, that's a sacred bond because we swear to keep them safe. Yeah. When you hear kind of in public, everything's going to be fine, but you get these people in private. This is not a debate because they will say, of course we're concerned. Because as the only thing that matters, sorry, America, but the only thing that matters to us is to keeping our assets safe. And if there are questions on this, particularly, and I think it's going to be subject related. For example, counterterrorism cooperation is going to continue. I wrote a piece for the Atlantic Council on this, and there's no doubt about that. But in terms of Russia, do you really think the British and the Estonians, some of our great partners, are going to share their human source reporting with us? They're just not going to. I don't care who says, and I will go to my grave on this, because just ethically, they cannot share with an administration, not only with Trump at the helm, but with someone, with a Kash Patel at the FBI, Tulsi Gabbard at DNI. I think Ratcliffe they would think would probably be okay, although he did declassify a great deal of Russia House intelligence. But ultimately, you're not a serious person if you're going to tell me everything's going to be fine, same as always. It just ethically, you just totally. As someone who used to engage in agent running, just doesn't make sense.
And I think that, what a lot of allied services are going to fall back on is the working level relationships that they have formed with people who do the jobs like the one that you were doing when, you retired in the years before that. Right. I mean, people who work on the fourth floor of the building, right? Who are not necessarily the executive suite.
Not the C-suite. I didn't
right.
get any
Right. And those kind of working relationships day to day where, let's face it, most of the security relationship does take place. Right. And I think in those conversations, what you can imagine is, maybe one country not briefing in such detail to their partners over at Langley, or maybe saying, is there a way that we can kind of keep this from being briefed up too high and just keep it among ourselves? Those things are going to have to be managed in a very delicate, attentive kind of way. There's going to be a lot of sort of second guessing and kind of tending of the garden much more closely, and that is that is a place that can breed anxiety, suspicion, dysfunction. I mean, we hope it doesn't come to that, but I think to your point, you're absolutely right. It's not just going to be business as usual. It is not business as usual when Tulsi Gabbard is the DNI.
No,
that is and we shouldn't pretend otherwise.
Well, this is the point in the podcast where we have to say goodbye to our guests who are not yet subscribers. If you want to listen to the rest of this podcast and to all the other shows in full, just go to the dsrnetwork.com and click on membership. It's only $7 a month, and it brings you a lot of great bonus content. So if you're not a subscriber, we hope you will be soon. And if you are one, stand by. We'll be back in a moment.